As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
A New Year's resolution worth keeping. In the closing days of 2023, the Biden administration once again announced a large military aid package for Ukraine, this time a mere $250 million. Without a new authorization of funds from Congress, it is said to be the last bit of money left over from the more than $100 billion already authorized by Congress for the proxy war with Russia through Ukraine. President Biden's request for an additional $100 billion to spread around Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan was rejected by a Congress eager for its winter break, and with each passing day, it looks like it's going to be harder to push it through. Poll after poll shows that Americans are increasingly opposed to more of their money being spent on neocons' lost cause war to overthrow Putin in Russia. For example, a recent Fox News poll revealed that more than 60% of Republican voters do not want any more money sent to Ukraine. As we enter an election year, it's probably safe to predict that Republican candidates will be wary of crossing the wishes of the clear majority of voters. That is why the Biden administration has been desperately trying to reframe its request for more Ukraine war money as anything but a request for more Ukraine war money. For example, they even brought back the old discredited domino theory used to justify U.S. actions in the Vietnam War. If we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, Biden said in December, then he will keep going into Western Europe where we will be forced to fight him there. On the one hand, supporters of the Ukraine war warn that Russia is about to reconstitute the Soviet empire in Europe, while at the same time, the same people will tell us Russia is out of missiles and on its last leg. One more infusion of U.S. money will end the Russian threat once and for all. Both of these things cannot be true at once. In fact, neither of them is true. But still, the administration, much of Congress, and an insatiable military-industrial complex keeps selling the lies. Last month, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken inadvertently revealed what exactly all the spending for war is about when he stated that as much as 90% of the aid for Ukraine is actually spent in the United States. The money is used to the benefit of American business, local communities, and strengthening the U.S. defense industrial base. He said in an interview, in other words, the money for Ukraine is actually a massive welfare program for well-connected military contractors back home. As we begin the year 2024, we need to home in on the real threat to the United States. It is not Russia or China or Iran. The true threat is closer to home. It is a corrupt system that bleeds the country dry to fight imaginary enemies while enriching the military-industrial complex. For the new year, Congress should resolve to end the stranglehold of the military-industrial complex by reining in out-of-control military spending. Members should simply vote no on military spending bills until they are drafted to benefit the American people rather than the Beltway elite. I don't hold out much hope of this happening in the short run, but it only takes a few dedicated members to make it a real difference. Thanks for listening.
Israeli drone strike kills senior Hamas official in Beirut. So an Israeli drone strike hit a Hamas office in Beirut on Tuesday, killing at least 6 people, including a senior Hamas official. And this was initially reported by Lebanese media. Later in the day, a U.S. official told the Washington Post that Israel was responsible for the strike that killed Salah al-Aruri, who's the deputy chief of Hamas's Politico bureau. So this Israeli attack on Lebanon's capital is a huge, huge escalation, and it could provoke a major war. Hamas has confirmed that al-Aruri was killed and released a statement on his assassination. The statement said, quote, "The cowardly assassinations carried out by the Zionist occupation against the leaders and symbols of our Palestinian people inside and outside Palestine will not succeed in breaking the will and steadfastness of our people or in undermining the continuation of their valiant resistance," end quote. So al-Aruri was involved in hostage negotiations. According to the Times of Israel, and I saw several Israeli and Arab outlets report the same thing, he was instrumental in reaching the Qatar-mediated deal that led to the release of over 100 Israeli hostages and over 200 Palestinian prisoners. There was about a week-long truce during that time. So he was involved in that, and that's who Israel takes out. So far, Israel has not officially taken credit for the attack. that's kind of how they operate when it comes to assassinations in other countries. They're usually very vague. I saw some Israeli officials were asked about it, and they chose not to comment. They don't deny it, but they don't want to officially take responsibility. But this strike marks the first Israeli attack on Beirut since the 2006 Lebanon war. So again, that's how significant of an escalation this is. This was reported by Axios on Monday. And the report said that Israel rejected an offer made by Hamas through Qatari and Egyptian mediators on a new hostage deal. The report, which cited unnamed Israeli officials, said that Israel received the offer on Sunday and conveyed that it was unacceptable the following day. The proposal included a 3-phase process that would have started with Israel beginning to pull its forces from Gaza and Hamas releasing 40 hostages. All the details on the proposal were not clear, but this deal the idea was to end the Israeli attack on Gaza, end the war altogether once the final phase was implemented, which would have involved Hamas releasing all of the Israeli military personnel that it has held captive. But Israeli officials have vowed that the assault on Gaza will go on and continue through the entire year of 2024. One Israeli official said, quote, "The proposal we received from Hamas on Sunday was totally off base, and we asked the mediators to try and produce a more acceptable proposal. They're working on it, and let's see what happens," end quote. So while Israel rejected the deal, Israeli officials said the proposal showed that Hamas is willing to negotiate, despite previously saying that there would be no talks until a full ceasefire. So look at the timeline of this. On Monday, this report was on Monday. These Israeli officials told Axios that they thought Hamas might be serious about negotiating again. The next day, they kill one of their negotiators. I mean, it goes to show they just want to keep this thing going. So despite the mass slaughter Israel is committing in Gaza, there are no serious discussions within the Biden administration about cutting off Israel or placing any conditions on military aid. This was reported by the New York Times on Sunday. This might sound like a familiar story because I've covered similar things before, but I think it's important to reiterate to show that all this talk about concerns about civilian casualties, concerns about what's going to happen after the war, it's all just talk. They're still supporting this thing to the hilt 100%. So I want to read this quote from the New York Times report because it's interesting. It said, quote, "Israeli officials recognize that Biden is the most important ally they have amid rising global criticism, and they understand that he is the only thing stopping the United Nations from imposing sanctions," end quote. So besides the unconditional military support, the U.S. also provides political cover and vetoed or worked to water down several resolutions at the UN Security Council that called for a ceasefire in Gaza. It'll be interesting to see how the U.S. approaches this ICJ case with the genocide case that South Africa has brought. I haven't really seen much about the U.S. responding to that. So the death toll in Gaza surpassed 22,000 on Tuesday, according to Gaza's health ministry. That includes over 8,000 children, and over 57 Palestinians have been wounded, nearly 90% displaced. And Biden is happily supporting this. And that was demonstrated by this past Friday. His administration once again bypassed Congress to get more weapons into Israel's hands, and those were artillery shells. So as the war in Ukraine nears the end of its second year, Ukrainians are turning against fighting and towards diplomacy. One former official said that Ukrainian soldiers are currently fighting and dying for nothing. So this is another Ukrainian official. This was also reported by the Times, who said, quote, "Many Ukrainians are growing tired and weary of the war." One Ukrainian military source admitted that average Ukrainians were talking of a truce, yet there were questions around what the price of the truce would be, end quote. Most people in Ukraine wanted a truce, but they were afraid to admit it. And this is according to a political, Mikhailo Shaplaiha, definitely butchered his name. He's a Ukrainian former vice ombudsman of Ukraine, which is kind of like a human rights official. He said that there was an atmosphere of total mistrust and fear in Ukraine, and anyone who dared to think of a truce would be labeled as an outcast and a traitor. So Zelensky's kind of in a similar position to Netanyahu, I think. It's not that we're seeing polls that want him to step down, but Zaluzhny, who's the Ukrainian commander-in-chief, their top general, the public trusts him much more, according to polls, and he's considered a potential candidate if Zelensky ever allows presidential elections to happen. But you got to figure if this war does end and there's a peace deal and Ukraine has to cede a big chunk of its territory, I mean, Zelensky, politically, he's going to be done then. So he also has an interest to keep this going no matter, and he doesn't seem to be concerned with how many Ukrainian soldiers are going to die as this thing drags on.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
Your new Trends Journal's out. And what's your Trends Journal about? The top trends of 2024. Oh, yeah, we got some year ahead. But that's only our trends. But you might want to go to the Cartoon News Network, CNN, because they have the 8 biggest makeup trend predictions of 2024, according to makeup artists. That's the kind of crap they put out there and other worthless stuff. Journalism is dead. All they do is spew out bullshit because they're little gutless boys and girls, little prostitutes, media whores that get paid to put out by their corporate pimps and government whoremasters. This is the kind of shit they gave you. Number one, World War III. That's right. We said World War III began 2 days before Russia invaded Ukraine in February 22nd, 2022. Now the Middle East meltdown. Again, the war started back then, but it only becomes official when there's that false flag, that real big thing. Like they assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo when that began World War I. They taught me that in school. Yeah, fuckface. It's been going on long before that. Same thing with World War III. But this year it's going to become official. Because as we warned, Ukraine is losing this war. They're going to do something major to get back on the news. And then there's the Israel war. Again, which we warned about. Now, Middle East meltdown, top trend of 2023. So, this morning, this was the news. Israel army launches attacks on targets in Syria and Lebanon. Hey, we could kill anybody we want. America, oh yeah, we could do it any place that we want to. We're the exceptionals, and they're the chosen people. So they could do anything that they want. You could kill anybody anywhere you want. So shut the fuck up and swallow. Oh, by the way, people don't like my language. Fuck off. Once upon a time, for all you little boys and girls with little guys like that and little dry nothings, used to be a movie. Yeah. And at the end of the movie, the guy's irate about what's going on. And he says, I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore. Screaming at the top of his lungs. I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. No, but maybe all those boys and girls, they like taking it up the ass from Lindsey Graham because he give it to you like that. Or Chucky Schumer. Or out of his mind Biden. Or arrogant Trump. Oh, no, let's go over to Israel. We got Netanyahu. Oh, your new Trends Journal's out, right? Yeah. This is part of our Trends Journal, where we're telling our subscribers. With President Joe Biden coming up for re-election, and with only a 39% approval rating, he and Israel President Benjamin Netanyahu, whose ratings are also in the toilet, which he should be flushed down, with only 15% of Israelis wanting him to stay in office after the war on Hamas. Both will do all they can to stay in office by ramping up wars to manipulate the public to their benefit. World War III. So I hope we're here next year to give you the top trends of 2025. Because if we don't stand up for peace, we're screwed. Golden year for gold. That's right. Way up, way up. Again, all things are connected. Gold is going to be the number one safe haven asset as things go down the toilet. Yeah. And they're going down the toilet. Because we've got a bunch of shitheads filled with shit coming out of their mouths, spewing it all over the world. The whole fucking world has become one toilet bowl of shit from the politicians. So anyway, we explain why gold is going up. Also, interest rates are going down. Death of the dollar. Mwah, bye-bye. Oh, the big news is they fired that woman from Harvard. Yep. That's the big news. Harvard, Princeton, Yale, bullets, bombs, and banks. Oh, and by the way, talking about bullets and bombs, I read you this article that came out. Israeli army launches attacks on targets in Syria and Lebanon. Again, expanding World War III. Guess what? They just wiped out explosion in Beirut on Tuesday. That's today. Killed a top official with a Palestinian militant group. They're not militants to the Palestinians. Hamas and 3 others. Yep. That's right. If Israel is behind the attack, it should mark a major escalation in the Middle East conflict, Hezbollah leader Syed Hassan Nasrallah said, and he vowed to retaliate against any Israeli targeting of Palestinian officials in Lebanon. Hey, fuck you. Israel could slaughter anybody they want anywhere. Again, occupied territories, settlers, they stole the fucking land in violation of the Geneva Conventions, threw out the Palestinians, been slaughtering them on and on and on. Wrote about it in detail in your Trends Journal when Netanyahu got into office. It only escalated. Not my language, the language in the mainstream media. His extreme right-wing government. And now they're saying his extreme right-wing government Get all the Palestinians out of there. That's right. Yeah. Hey, they stole all the other land. Why not steal this land? Oh, you know why it's good for them? Because another arrogant fuck, the president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, said, God gave us this land, which I'd say to you, fuck you.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
The number one story that I got back, which is interesting because we haven't talked about this that much, but the number one story was Javier Milei.
Ooh.
Becoming presidente of Argentina. Look, it is a pretty interesting story that this guy, and here's the thing, this is why I haven't talked about it that much on the show, because I don't know. I don't pay attention to Argentina. I learned they were a country when Javier Milei won the presidency. That's when I was like, oh, I guess this is evidently a place. But it is pretty interesting that he won on this crazy libertarian message. And so that is now, a lot of people say he's not the real deal, he's a fraud or something. I have no idea. I'm not telling you he is real or he is a fraud. But in many ways, that doesn't really matter. Because it's like the point is that he won on what he was saying.
And he was ballsy with the talking points. He was in your face. Your policies are killing people. It's not freedom. Here's how we save our country. I mean, he really rammed it down people's throats. The other thing he did, which I think could be, I see a positive storyline here, is he said that he's going to dollarize the country. And I could see that fixing some of their problems, because as bad as our Federal Reserve is and how much overspending we do, that does peg them to something that's, let's say it's a ship that's not sinking as quickly. So
yeah, well, they've had hyperinflation in that country.
But the other side of it is that actually is like, you might have thought the regime would cancel this guy because, hey, we can't have a libertarian, we can't have a guy talking about freedom. But when all of a sudden you say, hey, I'll give you the number one thing that you want, which is your dollars coming down here and more people using the dollars, you played the right card to win over the people who really have power.
Yeah, a lot of libertarians were like, well, okay, I think this guy's not the real deal because he's like waving an Israeli flag and he's saying I'll peg my currency to the dollar, and he bailed on the BRICS agreement. But I just kind of look at it and I go, look, you have to have look. I'm not saying he's the real deal. I don't know. Maybe he's a CIA plant. I have no idea. But you have to have a little bit of a different standard of what you think like American politicians should be. Like, America is the empire of the world. Argentina, we just found out existed. Okay? Like, it's a different situation. And if you are, let's say, a tiny country in in our hemisphere, and you lead what is essentially a revolution, you're leading a revolution in a country in our hemisphere, you kind of gotta play ball. Because if you were to come out and go, America, the dollar, I'm going with BRICS, it would be like, isn't that crazy? His plane crashed. It was like
so weird.
So like,
Bermuda Triangle at it again, huh?
Yeah. So like, if he's just saying, hey, I'll play ball with America, but I'm slashing my federal workforce, I'm willing to listen and go, okay. Seems pretty good.
I think it's potentially a huge win, because I think he played a winning hand with we're going to dollarize the country. I think that wins over the regime that he'll be able to stay in power. And I think if the country actually does turn around, that should be an incredible talking point for liberty.
Yeah, look, if the country turns around, this is going to be the most amazing thing, especially if it's because of his policies. But regardless, you just can't deny, like, look, dude, this is something that happened in 2023. A guy who self-identifies as an anarcho-capitalist Austrian economist won the presidency preaching this pure libertarian socialist the elites message. That you got to look at that and be like, that's pretty incredible. That was definitely, for us, for people who listen to this show, one of the biggest things that happened over this last year.
So I live in New Jersey, somewhat unfortunately, but I am a signer for the Free State Project, and I have a lot of hope for New Hampshire. So my question is, do you think a secession movement, whether it be New Hampshire, Texas, California, or any other state, is a distraction or a move towards more human freedom?
Oh, I think it's 100% a move toward more human freedom. But I think that at least the stage that we're in now, I think if we're being honest, is that it's the amazing things about secession movements, and whether that's New Hampshire talking about seceding, or the Texit, or even Calexit, or like any of that, is that it just stretching the Overton window into like people accepting that, like, yeah, maybe we could break apart. And like that, I don't think that we're anywhere near a place where we're actually going to see a state secede in the immediate future. I think that's going to take time. And I think that the truth is, and I don't like this, and I'm sure you don't either, but if any state tried to secede right now, the U.S. federal government will fucking put that shit down. They will not let that happen. There's no chance. Yeah. You don't think so?
There's historical precedent.
Well, what do you... My point is that, yeah, we have a lot more work to do before we get to a point where it could actually happen and be successful. What do you think? You disagree with me? You said, really? Like, you think if...
I was being sarcastic.
Oh, yeah, okay.
The conversation is fruitful.
I think so. Because I think it stretches the Overton window, and I think it makes people look at the conversation and go and ask themselves a lot of questions and go, yeah, why aren't you allowed to secede?
Well, I like how Jersey it was that chick didn't need a microphone.
It was Jersey.
Can I just also throw...
I don't need no mic. Hey, Dave, here's my question.
Also, here's a palm. No, but can I just throw this out there as somebody who still lives in Brooklyn, New York, around people? Here's the thing: is there's a lot of people get very. If you say the word secession, people immediately leap to slavery. If you just go, well, what if that's why the California thing is great, because if you go, well, what if California seceded? Would that be about slavery? And they can't answer the question. It is a fantastic conversation.
That's a good point. And to also just point out to them that it's hey, if California seceded, you guys could have everything you want. You'd have universal health care and all that shit. You got the votes for everything.
They could put G on the money.
Yeah.
Don't tread on us.
When you think of examples where liberty really flourishes, do certain times in American history come to mind? Is it other countries? Is it the degree to which people have freedoms in certain countries? What are your empirical examples of liberty working for the masses or being very beneficial?
Oh, good. Excellent question. I think if you look at early American history, especially before the Civil War, you had a much lighter government with a huge exception of slavery, which was a great blemish on the country. And you had groups of women in many areas or in cases did not have the full right to own property or contract. But aside from those two huge caveats, you had vastly more freedom. You had more prosperity. You had people building up lives of their own. And for the 1840s and 1850s, you had relatively low tariff barriers. So the U.S. was a lot more connected to the world markets than it had been before or afterwards. And certainly until it was, until long after World War II. So.
When it comes to propaganda techniques that people should be aware of, I'm curious what you think are the great propaganda techniques that people need to watch out for. The one that comes to mind while you're thinking of that is the concept of no costs. Or they will say something like, well, we're going to bring democracy to Libya. We're going to keep people safe by having a federal bureau of investigation. It's federal, so it's for everyone. A bureau, nice building. An investigation. What's wrong with investigating? You're just looking into things. So all these times we're going to stop Putin from taking over Eastern Europe. Well, they're just stopping him. There's no downside. There's no collateral damage. So that is the one that I always come across where they say there's only benefits. We should have universal free healthcare, which is as dumb as saying, the military's free because the government pays for it. So this concept of them always saying that there's only benefits and no costs is what I think is the biggest propaganda technique. What are some of the ones you come across that people should watch out for?
Well, that's a good example of a propaganda technique, and it works well for people that failed mathematics. Because if there's always, anytime you have the government forcibly intervening, there's going to be costs. And simply because the government can sweep the costs under the rug, or the government, the pro-government media is going to ignore it, it doesn't mean the costs don't exist. There were all kinds of appeals, especially after 9/11. You're either with us or against us. Back when George W. Bush promised to rid the world of evil, I knew America was screwed because you're basically unleashing total power, and you have with the way that the Bush's appointees seize that power as far as torture, as far as total surveillance, as far as launching wars on false premises. I don't know why anybody would have expected a happy ending.
Yeah, definitely seems like when you give people this blank check, they almost inevitably abuse it. And I think of, well, if I were in their situation, I might do the same exact thing. I would be so tempted to take advantage. I mean, it's just so, self-serving to say, if I were given a blank check, I'd put a small amount on the check. It's like, well, these people are such status and they love voting for it, so maybe I'm going to take advantage of it. So the whole thing is not necessarily, well, we need to elect different Democrats or Republicans, but instead privatize everything to where people actually bear the cost of the downsides of how they act. When it comes to privatizing things, I think of the importance of schooling along with private security. When it comes to solutions, do you see the private sector filling in any of the voids created by the state as far as people needing a genuine service like education or protection of their property?
Yeah, I've got a chapter in the book called Schools Gone Wild. And it was fun to walk through some of the crazy stuff the feds have done with No Child Left Behind, for instance, which basically encouraged states to lower their education standards in order to claim that they were making adequate progress and therefore keep getting their federal grants. Then you had the Obama administration come in and actually set up specific racial goals for different races, blacks, Hispanics, whites. And in state after state, the Obama administration certified lower goals for black students and for white students. Now, if George Wallace had done this down in Alabama, people would have been outraged. And there were some NAACP groups and some black parents that were outraged by this, but it got swept under the rug. Then you've got the Obama folks dragged in Common Core, which dragged down reading and math. It's made a complete mess out of the math teaching. And then you had the teacher unions helping shut down the schools during the COVID lockdowns, and just horrendous impact on minority and low-income students, much worse than other students because the minority and low-income students were less likely to have good internet access or, parents to say, hey, pay attention, do your work, stuff like that. So, yeah, I mean, and almost anything is going to be better than that. I mean, I think back to my own time in high school. It was one of the most brain-dead times of my life. Some people might think that the current book is an exception to that, but and it was just, getting out of the mandatory schooling environment was just, it was like mentally liberating. And I've heard the same from a lot of kids who were in government schools and then started to be homeschooled or went to private schools because, the whole idea that thinking people have to have a tenured government official blathering in front of them in order to learn a subject is like, where did this ever come from?
Category 1 is the word void. If you've watched or listened to the show for any amount of time, we know that you're familiar with the term void. But here's how Oliver Ellsworth put it in the Connecticut Ratifying Convention. He was the third Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he said, if they make a law which the Constitution does not authorize, it is void. And to me, that is a perfect description of almost all the federal acts, laws, rules, regulations, and orders on the books today, whether it's the ATF, the DEA, or anything in between. We have to recognize that if they don't have the authority to do it, it's not up to them to determine whether they have the authority to do it or not. It's just void because the Constitution is supreme. I'll get a little bit more into that in just a moment. Here's Thomas Jefferson in the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. He said, whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. So anytime the federal government, even the smallest thing, assumes a power that was not delegated to it by the people of the several states in the Constitution, it's unauthoritative, void, and of no force. And on the other end of the spectrum, let's go with a little Alexander Hamilton. I mean, if you look at my X profile, I think my pronouns include Hamilton hater, but sometimes some of the quotes are great and they actually make a lot of sense. But of course, we know that he flip-flopped before and after ratification on what the powers delegated to the federal government were going to be. But here he is in Federalist number 78 in the before end of the spectrum here. And he put it this way: there is no position which depends on clearer principles than that every act of a delegated authority contrary to the tenor of the commission under which it is exercised, is void. So that's the Hamiltonian flair of basically saying an act against the Constitution is void, which I'll get to again in a moment. He said, no legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution can be valid. And Hamilton, of all people, even though he thought everything was some kind of an implied power, this is a really important point. He said, to deny this would be to affirm that the deputy is greater than his principal, that the servant is above his master, that the representatives of the people are superior to the people themselves, that men acting by virtue of powers may do not only what their powers do not authorize, but what they forbid. So it is absurd to say that the federal government is authorized in any way to exercise a power beyond the Constitution, because the Constitution reaffirms that the federal government is the bottom of the food chain. The people of the several states are the top of the food chain. And to say that the federal government gets to determine if the federal government violated the rules given to the federal government by the people of the several states, well, he said this is absurd. This would affirm that the deputy is greater than the principal. But what are we supposed to be doing about it? That leads me to the next category. The first one was void. Second was about enforcement. It's up to the people to enforce. And then how do you do that? The people and, of course, the states. James Madison put it this way in Federalist number 46. He said the states and individuals should use a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. For the father of the Constitution, if you want to stop federal overreach, if you want to stop federal policies that you think are unwarrantable, as Madison called it, or even just bad policy, Madison said this should be used even against bad policy, even if you think it's constitutional for them to do it. That doesn't, just because something's constitutional doesn't mean you have to be cool with how they approach it. He said states and individuals should use a refusal to cooperate. So in other words, in order to stop the feds, you have to disobey them. They're the ones really in most situations who are doing the disobedience. They're the ones disobeying the Constitution, and refusing to comply with them is what will keep them in check. And as I was kind of hinting at just a minute ago here, James Otis Jr. put it this way: so long as people will submit to arbitrary measures, so long will they find masters. So as long as people are willing to comply with stuff the government isn't supposed to do in the first place, they're going to find all kinds of willing politicians, bureaucrats, deep state. I don't care what you call these people. They're monsters. There are plenty of people who want to rise to positions of power to use your willingness to submit to arbitrary measures, and they're going to keep throwing more and more and more at you all along. That was in 1762. Otis again, James Otis Jr. in 1767, writing as freeborn American. He said, there is nothing that will this is a paraphrase. Again, that'll be linked to in the show notes, all the original source documents over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. A few hours after this live stream is done this morning here on the West Coast. He said, there is nothing that will destroy liberty more than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges. I think that one bears repeating. James Otis Jr. tells us that the most dangerous thing to liberty is mass compliance. You're not going to comply your way out of tyranny. And here it is again. There is nothing that will destroy liberty more than a prevailing opinion that is better. Let me try it again. There is nothing that will destroy liberty more than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges. April of 1790. We are not to expect to be translated from despotism to liberty in a featherbed. This is not going to be a silver bullet. There is no single nullification action. There is no amendment. There is no vote the bums out strategy. None of it is, there is no silver bullet. Anyone who promises you a silver bullet on how we're going to go from the largest government in history to a real land of the free is a grifter. They're lying. They're ignorant, maybe a combination. It's just absurd to think that. And here's how Jefferson put it a few months earlier in a letter to his friend, the Reverend Charles Clay. This is a great strategist here. We have to actually think about, like, okay, these guys actually understood what they were talking about. He said, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. We must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. Because, and this is my version of it, but Jefferson basically said, because it takes time to convince people what is even for their own good. We can show them as many books and articles and podcasts and videos, but unless we show them how it plays out in practice, people just dig their heels in. And especially these days, as it keeps getting, we get more and more centralized power. People become more faction first, party first. They dig their heels in. Whether they're flipping sides based on who's in power or not, they'll clearly flip-flop over and over and over. So the only way to win is to do the right thing, learn how to exercise our rights, whether the government wants us to or not, and recognize that it's going to be a very long slog to go from the largest government in history to a real land of the free. Now,
this whole system that we work with is participating in our so-called right to intervene and our responsibility to make the world safe for democracy and all of that, which is a bunch of hooey and makes it very dangerous for the American people, and has not only nothing to do with our national defense, it has something to do with undermining our national defense. And that's what we're suffering from now, because we don't even have the money left to defend our borders.
It was a 3-year commemoration of the assassination of General Soleimani, the head of the Revolutionary Guards. He was on a peace mission in Baghdad, of all places, when Trump did probably the stupidest thing in his presidency. Now, he lobbed some bombs over to Syria on that bogus chemical attack, but he basically hit some empty buildings. He's kind of like, I got to do something, I'll do this, no big deal. But he was goaded into this. I would love to hear what went on behind the scenes, because I can imagine Pompeo and all the neocons surrounding him, telling him, here's your chance, you got to take him out, you got to do this guy's going to attack Americans, just lying to the hilt. I think they really talked him into doing this, but I wonder what he was saying to them and how he was receiving their call. But it turned out to be the stupidest thing he did in his presidency. And now, on the commemoration of the 3rd anniversary, there's this attack in Iran, in Kerman, where the cemetery is, and it's the biggest terrorist attack in Iran since 1981. So 40 years. Assad, could be the U.S., we don't know, but I guess as with all crimes like this, you would ask who benefits. Now, some people have suggested, I've seen some people on Twitter neocons suggesting that Iran did it itself to its own people to keep them hating Israel. That's a possibility. We don't know. We don't know that it's not true. But when you look at who might benefit from it, it doesn't seem to point in that direction.
Well, Netanyahu's losing support from,
big
from
time.
the Israeli people, and it's down to 15%. And they say as soon as the war's over, we're going to get rid of them.
Well, the war is not going well for Israel in Gaza, and that's pretty clear. They're very good at dropping bombs on civilians from 20,000 feet or what have you, and blowing up 20-some thousand of them. They're pretty good at that. But urban warfare is different. And ironically, by bombing the Gaza Strip into the Stone Age, what the Israeli military has done is created enormous number of firing points. And I've seen video after video of Hamas fighters hiding behind buildings and just taking out tanks, taking out groups of soldiers. They didn't count on this. They're not doing well in urban warfare. And in fact, Netanyahu announced that they are withdrawing 5 brigades from Gaza and decommissioning them, taking them home. They're coming home. They're scaling back the war. There's dissent in the ranks. You talk about the unpopularity of Netanyahu. I'm just reading a piece in Haaretz, an Israeli left-wing newspaper, talking about a large, almost unbridgeable disparity between the understanding that the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, are already in the midst of a deployment for the 3rd stage of the war in Gaza and what the political decision makers are projecting outwardly. There's a real fight between the military and the political. And so that is leading, I think, to them striking out more. They struck out in Beirut. That's an obvious escalation, looking to maybe take away some of the attention. But the other thing, and if we can go to the next clip, in a rare rebuke from the State Department, they've also started talking about, in the open, about ethnic cleansing. Now, here is the spokesman of the State Department, Dr. Paul Matthew Miller, and he started out yesterday. He said the U.S. rejects the inflammatory and irresponsible statements from Israeli ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. There should be no mass displacement of Palestinians from Gaza. So they're getting nervous, and if you go to the next one, here's what Ben-Gvir said. He said, we need to encourage the residents of Gaza to emigrate. It's a solution we must advance. The word solution here is very sensitive in this context. And so the State Department responded to this, saying we don't accept this language. And then Ben-Gvir, well, he wasn't going to take it lying down. If you can put the next one up. And I'm just putting this on, Dr. Paul, just to show some of the frustration. He responded by saying, I greatly appreciate the United States of America, but with all due respect, we are no longer a star on the American flag. All of our missiles, the ammunition, the precision-guided bombs, all the airplanes and bombs, it's all from the U.S. The minute they turn off the tap, you can't keep fighting. You have no capability. Everyone understands that we can't. So it's on the one hand, yes, you have the right to do whatever you think is right. On the other hand, we as Americans have the right to say, okay, we don't want to be behind it. We don't want this blood on our hands.
The military is out of control. We have to control that. We also have the spending is out of control. And all this is coming together right now. So that is why it's so important not to think of how are we going to cut the budget by 1% next year, which they won't even vote for. What can you do? It has to be based on a principle. Somebody say, well, you can't have these absolute principles like no foreign intervention and only do it under the Constitution. Well, that's where the leak goes. After that, you don't ever have to go to Congress for a declaration of war. You don't have to go and revamp the monetary system. The financing is simple. The Fed does whatever the Congress wants it to do. The debt runs up, and the Federal Reserve prints the money. So it's a bigger picture, and it's philosophic, and it has to do with one specific understanding, what personal liberty is all about. If you start from there and work up, we will end up with a system similar to and maybe better than what the founders had hoped for, because they were anxious for us to have individual personal liberty. Unfortunately, we have abused that opportunity. Let's try and change that and make it better for the individual to gain one's freedom.